We are in a social media era. We first discovered ICT Pulse on Facebook and were amazed by the quality of Michele Marius' chronicles about cybercrime in the Caribbean. She has interviewed cybersecurity key players all over Caribbean, participated to a recent Miami event about cybersecurity in the Caribbean again. Today she will share with us her experience about this delicate issue. Ladies and gentlemen, ICT Pulse editor and publisher, Michele Marius. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. And thanks, Pierre, for that rousing introduction. As you can see, the presentation I'm going to be doing this morning is certainly another dimension of what the minister spoke about. He spoke about ICT being a driver of development and investment in Jamaica, we becoming net exporters. But what we already have begun to see happening is that we in Jamaica are sometimes the victims and the perpetuators of crime, cybercrime, and intrusions. So I want to just look at this a little bit more closely and share some of the findings that I have to date. Now, these, I guess, are just some of the recent incidences of cybercrime within the region. Some of them were quite prevalent in the news. You would remember about the attack on Lyme in Barbados and the hackings that occurred in Trinidad and Tobago. However, I was quite surprised when I was putting the presentation together a few weeks ago and saw that TAJ had also been victim of an attack, as the report came out in June of this month, so probably about 2 weeks ago. And I was quite intrigued that perhaps no one here from TAJ is at the session today, because it might be just useful to find out whether or not they recognize that there had been in some sort of incident. But as Pierre indicated, I had done some interviews with some specialists across the region, and what I'm going to do now is probably go through some of their own thoughts about what is the state of cybersecurity within the region. And as you can see, I think there was a great concern that we have not really been as aware of the attacks that have been happening, the incidences that have been happening. One of the greatest sources for these sorts of intrusions and incidents are Russia, China, and Hong Kong. And I think there is a general consensus that we probably have not really looked at cybersecurity in a very holistic sense, and neither are we putting the resources, whether money and human resource, to really begin to seriously tackle the situation at hand. And one of the most important things I actually learned recently, and I think if you think about it, it probably creates a completely different dimension. We have situations, of course, where persons are experiencing some sort of threat. They're being attacked by some entity overseas, or at least that we are not clear exactly where it's coming from. And as the minister mentioned, we have the lotto and telemarketing scams that have been happening, and of course other incidences that probably we see sporadically in the paper. But we also have a situation where Jamaica, who has friendly relationships with a number of countries, may find that our networks, our systems are being compromised by others and then being used as a pivot point for targets. So, what is the situation in Jamaica? I spent a little bit of time, luckily the cybercrime unit, was very helpful, and they provided me with some data. But just before that, at least we do know that cybercrime, there is some sort of framework here in Jamaica dealing with cybercrime. We have the Cybercrimes Act. We know that we have, for example, a lot of scams, and the cybercrime unit, which has been established, has been working assiduously with assistance from overseas law enforcement to get a handle on the situation. And of course, in the press, we recognize that there have been some arrests being made. They still can't find all the money, but hopefully that will sort itself out in due course. I guess through the cybercrime unit, they have at least begun to collect some statistics on their crime. And in 2011, 32 cases, they worked on 32 cases. And this is just a little breakdown as to at least some of what I would consider the charges that they sought to prosecute persons under. So you have obscene publications, denial of service, access with intent to commit or facilitate commission of an offense, unauthorized data access, and unauthorized modification of data. And even now here in 2012, up until May, we already have 26 cases. Last year it was 32, and now we are already at 26. And as you can see, the breakdown again. But all the reports so far doesn't necessarily tell us much from a cybersecurity perspective. The unit itself will be trying to prosecute crimes and investigating crimes according to the legislation, what constitutes a crime under the Act. And of course, because it is local legislation, the focus is going to be on crimes more or less originating in Jamaica. There might not necessarily be a very comprehensive framework to address crimes that are initiated overseas, but for which we are experiencing the brunt of it. And of course, we can only imagine that the cases that have been reported and that the cybercrime unit is working on is only a drop in the bucket. Now, at least with all that relative doom and gloom, and I think one of my general observations sometimes is that we can, in trying to impart the gravity of the situation, we can sometimes, it can come across that people get a bit overwhelmed. Either you're overwhelmed or you probably feel a little bit skeptical about the whole thing. So at least what I'm going to try to do now is at least to give us some sort of insight as to how we can probably begin to address some of the issues. But first, I guess we just need to recognize the following. Well, I guess for many of us, even for us who have had accounts hacked personally, you can feel very helpless and it can be quite debilitating. From a business perspective, it can cost millions of dollars, and certainly to try to remedy the situation can be just very expensive and very disruptive to operations. And of course, what can also happen is that companies are having their own experiences, or persons individually are having some sort of incident occur, but we don't necessarily know who is having it. We only know for ourselves, has there been a pattern? What are probably some of the other symptoms? What are probably some of the other features of the attacks that we may not be experiencing and perhaps others have that we could benefit from? At this point, I think there is a certain degree of isolation, and this is not necessarily just the case in Jamaica, but across the region. And of course, you have the situation, of course, where companies are afraid to report that they have had some sort of incident. Sometimes they don't even know that they've had one. They might see something happening on the network, but really don't have the tools with which to begin to do any sort of investigation. I guess having said all of this, as businesses, as organizations, as persons, we need to try to be as prepared as we can. We need to comprehensively examine our systems, networks, equipment, and I think we also need, as one of the experts from Barbados said that was interviewed for the post that Pierre had mentioned, is that we probably also need to think of cybersecurity in a more holistic sense. It's not just about, the actual individual pieces of what comprises the network, but how the network works together, even how the staff interfaces with the components that comprise the networks, and as well recognizing what your priorities are as it relates to the protection of data. You may need to consider prioritizing your data. What is the kernel of whatever it is that you're doing that absolutely cannot be, to the best of your ability, be compromised, and consider having probably a tiered structure. This was some of the stuff that came out in the discussions. And of course, we also just need to ensure that we are vigilant, and that does require investing in the maintenance, upgrading. I know some of the businesses, you may have, certainly we all have budgets, and you may find that just the time frame it takes within to secure additional equipment or upgrades relative to new developments that are happening, whether or not businesses may need to consider ways in which they can sort of expedite some of the procurement requirements, just to ensure that if new situations arise, that your organizations are agile and responsive enough to address those situations in an efficient manner. And we must also give some credit to supporting staff training and maintenance. Staff training and capacity building. And this may not necessarily just be limited to the technical team, those who would be working directly with a situation, with a cyber incident, but even just in terms of your general staff and some of the staff behavior that might need to be adjusted, and at least to get for those members to get some awareness as to what they ought to be doing to at least better support the organization in protecting its information and resources. However, having looked at what the organization has done and can do on its own, I do think that critically we need to move forward and to begin to develop trust relationships. We need to learn how to share. We need to learn that we're not in it alone, and that we ought to create a space where incidences can be reported, where we can have a team of experts that can offer some sort of assistance and support. We also need to begin to track these incidences. What is happening? Where are the threats coming from? What are the actual experiences on the ground? And really look at the systems that we need to put in place here in Jamaica, depending on industry. Some of it might be industry specific. And really try, I think, to look at the fact that there is strength in numbers, and I think we need to perhaps be a little bit more proactive in terms of how we go about tackling cybercrime. I do think that we sometimes can get a little bit mired in our own situation, and it is always good to consider that going forward, the criminals themselves are getting very sophisticated. They are now in syndicates. They have specialized tasks. Nobody is doing anything alone. You have reviewers and moderators of code. I mean, all of the things that you probably will find in very legitimate businesses have been adopted in the criminal world. And therefore, why are we going in some sort of scattershot approach to our security? Can we look and see how best we can develop a more coherent but also a greater support network among ourselves that we can then use to just improve the overall state of the security of our networks? I do think that folks from Palladium will be talking a little bit more about certs and, in their presentation. And just to note that this is, I think, one of the best ways that we can begin to approach a more coherent and unified method and supplementing the strategies that we have put in place to deal with cybersecurity and to address cybercrime and other incidences. And that's it. I think I'm on time here.